And we're live. Welcome, delegates, to the second episode of our YMCA MUNcast. And today, we'll be talking about space, especially relating to new technologies and developments, international politics, stuff like that. So this topic was actually suggested by Varun over here, um,
Hello, hello.
and you're one of the Security Council chairs this year. And one of the topics for your committee is going to be related to space, right? So
Yeah.
I would assume you're, pretty into space. Uh,
Yeah,
so-
space is one of those it's one of my hobbies to, learn about and think about. Um, you know, in honor of this podcast, I wore my NASA shirt.
oh boy.
Uh, yeah. So I'm quite a fan. It's one of my, one of my big things.
So what's that on your shelf? That's
um,
pretty spacey, like a black
this right here.
stormtrooper gun.
um, that is a Lego model of the Saturn V rocket. I can go bring it so you guys can get a better look.
Oh, that's bigger than I expected. Oh, perspective.
So
That's
this is
huge.
normal to have in one's bedroom, but it's a Lego version of the Saturn V rocket.
Hmm.
Um, I have quite a bit of space memorabilia on my desk. Here is um, the module that fits in here. It's quite
That's
it's
the
quite a
Apollo 11 one, right?
yeah. It's
The
the
one that went to the moon.
everything that launched the Apollo missions. I'm gonna put this down, but don't fall. All right. Yeah, that's everything that.
We don't want it to break.
I hope not. That took a lot of time to make. But
Stage preparation.
so it's one of those. It's what launched the Apollo missions, and then a couple of missions afterwards. But basically, what launched astronauts to the moon.
So the technology they had back then was definitely a lot different, right?
Yeah,
I remember like not just like the one thing, but the computer on board the Apollo 11 lander was like this huge bulky machine, right? And it wasn't even as powerful as like an iPhone 4.
yeah. So a lot of the computing was very basic on huge IBM computers that took up a massive room, and it was pretty hard because they were at that time technology hadn't advanced enough that it pales in comparison to what was in the next decade or two.
Hmm.
So you're launching humans on computers that barely have the processing power of like a TI-84, which is crazy when you think about it.
So like the technologies available have definitely changed, right?
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
But the Apollo 11 mission, I think, as I remember, was done during the Cold War, the space race, right? And the achievement of that time was getting a man on the moon, right? Because they didn't really do much after that. I feel like that was like the big thing that everybody knows.
Yeah, so definitely at that time, at the height of the Cold War, getting a man on the moon was, at the forefront of, the US and the Soviet Union's mind, but that's really where people stopped thinking about it. Because, at that time budget cuts, really stopped space exploration, but after that there's so many incredible achievements that we have in space exploration. We sent the Voyager spacecraft outside of our solar system. um, we launched the Hubble Space Telescope. We created space shuttles and a space station that orbits, our Earth, which is one of those things that when you actually think about it, it's kind of,
Pretty
uh,
impressive, right?
yeah, pretty
Very
impressive.
useful. So, obviously the space race that we were talking about, it's ended by now. Not so countries aren't as obsessed with bankrupting each other. But the space agencies have still stuck around. In fact, they've grown in number, right? Because a lot of countries that weren't engaged in space exploration are now definitely in the industry. So, what are some of the large agencies at play, in the international scene of space travel, and what are they doing nowadays?
So obviously, there's NASA, which is at the forefront of space exploration and has been since middle of the '60s. And right now, if you look at their history, there's landing someone on the moon, and then after the space race, it turned into sort of an age of cooperation, where countries, instead of going against each other, started building things like the International Space Station and working together more. And from that, you see different agencies pop up. But sorry. So NASA obviously has been doing big things. They sort of stagnated at the after the space shuttle stopped launching in
Hmm.
around 2011. But right now, they had this huge project called Gateway, which is their project to get people back to the moon and more sustainably, keep them more sustainably send people to the moon. Which we haven't done since 60 or 72.
Are they thinking of a colony?
Um, it's instead of yeah, basically it's basically a colony on the moon. Um, then you have China, which wasn't
Arrival.
really a big force back in the Cold War, but now they're doing incredible things. The biggest thing that happened in a while from China was they launched a lander on the dark side of the moon, which no other space agency had done prior. So that's pretty incredible when you think about it. Ooh, um,
What about
they
Russia? Because we've been competing them for you know forever.
Yeah. Russia right now, their biggest opportunity is actually working with NASA and
Mm.
sending astronauts to the International Space Station. Currently, the main way NASA sends astronauts to the International Space Station is paying for seats on the Soyuz spacecraft, which launched to the International Space Station along with Russian astronauts. So that's their main goal. And recently, as countries have started saying they want to go to the moon, Russia is also, along with everyone else, has stated that that's their goal. But their main opportunity right now is to send astronauts to the International Space Station.
So obviously, we can't quite talk about uh, these things without mentioning bigger changes in how the industry works, especially with the private sector uh, playing a larger role now, right? Because back in the days of Apollo missions, early space travel, space race, the programs were mostly subsidized and controlled by the governments because it was all about showing off, competing with each other. But after that, countries weren't as interested, I would say. So what you noticed as a trend was there was this era of cooperation between the space agencies of each country, and the governments were less on the reins about it. But companies started competing, like SpaceX and Boeing, aerospace companies, started expanding into uh, things like this and taking on the role of research and development in the last few years.
Yeah,
So, what are some like notable companies, divisions, and developments?
yeah. So as I said, the space exploration, really stagnated after the space shuttle stopped sending astronauts. There weren't really any advancements, and it was all being pushed back to a later date. But as private industry started growing more into the arena, the industry really got a jump start as SpaceX, Boeing, Virgin Galactic, they started ramping up their production. And SpaceX, obviously the biggest name in the private industry, um, with its Falcon 9 rocket, its Starlink satellites, its Falcon Heavy, and its newest project called Starship, which they say is gonna send about 100 people routinely to orbit to the moon, to Mars. So they've been doing quite a lot in that realm. But private industry is definitely jumpstart the industry.
Privatization is quite popular in the United States. but across the world, it's definitely generated a lot of backlash. Like a lot of people are questioning about it. Um, Former astronauts have even criticized it, like whether it might cause misincentives, and a bunch of other problems that come with for-profit companies. Uh, so it's become a political issue as well. How do you feel like privatization is going to play into this new era of space exploration, and to what degree should we allow it?
I think, personally, I think it's one of the best things that could have happened to space exploration.
Mm.
NASA, all these all these countries and their space programs really weren't doing anything. They weren't doing much, but now they have this opportunity through private companies like SpaceX, to launch satellites, to get their name, in that sphere of influence, and really in cooperation with countries, private industry will, without doubt, advance the industry more than it could have done by itself.
It is pretty inevitable, right? Because especially with NASA and the other agencies not being as hands-on anymore, and the government not really being as engaged with it. I think already, like, there's this statistic that's like 75% of the worldwide space enterprise is like already commercial because of GPS technology, broadcasting companies, satellites, and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. The governments have their control over those, but it's you're right. There's this new force growing in private industry.
mm. And I mean, like, it might be a good thing, right? Like you said, because especially now that there isn't an incentive for them to compete with anybody, uh, and in America at least, government agencies and bureaucratic organizations are known to be ineffective and inefficient. Um, like private industry can definitely like reinvigorate it, right, and bring in that sort of enterprise, entrepreneurship, competition, those sort of incentives that'll cause them to focus more on cost management and stuff like that.
Yeah.
um,
So like recently, I'm sure you guys have heard, but NASA just launched two astronauts into space from America aboard a SpaceX rocket, which might not seem really like a big deal, but when you think about it, the last time American astronauts have launched from America was when the space shuttle was still flying,
hmm.
and so you're talking about a historic shift from NASA's point of view, and it saves them money too. Like um, a seat on board the Soyuz spacecraft per astronaut costs like $86 million when flying from SpaceX, flying with SpaceX. Sorry, it only costs them 55 million, and that's a you
That's
know
a big change,
yeah
yeah.
30 million per astronaut. And when you're having lots and lots of missions, that cost really adds up.
Especially with the new technologies that SpaceX is introducing, right? Like, they're one of their biggest selling points is the fact that the rockets land themselves, or at least like the central stage, right? The
Yeah.
uh,
So yeah, their first stage, it lands itself, which um the company says costs or saves at least 10 million.
hmm,
Another thing that people might not know is launch when rockets launch um satellites, there's these on the nose cone. They're called fairings, which hold the satellite. Those have to come off eventually, and so they've found a way where they can catch them in boats with nets, which is basically what it is. It's a big boat with a net on top of it. Um, it's quite extraordinary, and those cost them about 6 million each. Which once again, mission after mission, it piles up. So they're really cutting costs across the board.
yeah, because with especially with the first ones, right? Like the Saturn V rocket you got there, like whenever a stage separated or like parts came off, like it would just like fall off, burn up in the atmosphere, or like go into the ocean. and NASA would like they would retrieve like some scraps, but never the entire thing. They would lose the engineering, uh, the usability. It almost always just ended up being recycled, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that they can reuse them now, and I think like Elon Musk said himself, like he intends to reuse like each major durable part like 100 times or something, which is just ludicrous.
Yeah,
And
that's
he estimates like a 30% reduction in cost per launch, which like 30% doesn't like okay, it sounds big, but like when you realize how much a launch costs in total, like it's big. It's easily, tens of millions of dollars per lunch, per launch. Um like just from material and engineering costs alone.
yeah.
And like they
Even
do that
the space shuttle had that problem where all the things that it
for
used to launch
boosters.
itself,
Yeah,
those are all just being you know
just jettison.
burned up in the atmosphere. Yeah,
Hmm.
and so when you think about it, like reusing all the major components of a rocket isn't something that ever has been thought of until recently with private industry.
Yeah, and it just goes to show like how capable the private industry is of like innovation of new things, right? Like the you would expect it to land on like a launch pad somewhere designated in like some facility somewhere, but SpaceX just went like, "No, we're going to move it around," and then built these drone ships named like ridiculous things like
Yeah, yeah,
read the instructions. And of course I still love you, which is the
yeah,
last one they used, which just like drove out on the ocean and then like picked up the rocket, um like a mobile launch pad, which is insane, right? Like
yeah,
now you don't need to find like the exact, like it's just incredible.
yeah. Landing a rocket vertically in the middle of the ocean is
Yeah, in
definitely
the middle of the
a
ocean.
crazy thing when you
Yeah,
really think about it.
definitely. And it like I mean, it's still super risky and expensive. Like it can still cost upwards of like I think $10,000 or even more, less, depending on what kind of rocket. But to launch a kilogram of matter is insane. Um, but it's definitely become a lot more accessible when you consider that they've reduced the cost by even half sometimes. But, with the question of accessibility, there also comes like with new technologies, there's always the concern of like whether it falls into the wrong hands, right? Or how it's going to be used and the risks that comes with it. Because that's just innate to all human innovation. So there's like a bunch of potential dangers. Space travel is still incredibly risky. Like when it first started, it was like deadly, but now it's like it's a little bit better, but it's still really risky. The industry still remembers the Challenger incident in 1986, where the launch rocket exploded due to I think a faulty O-ring or something, and it killed all 7 crew members. And then in 2008, which is like really recent, the Columbia space shuttle just disintegrated on reentry and killed another 7 crew members. And like you might watch the latest SpaceX launch successes, and like they're designed to be optimistic, right? And I think it's wonderful. But they don't show you the dozens of failures and rocket crashes and explosions that went along with it, which is why they never, do manned trials. Thank God. But like from an engineering standpoint, it's still incredibly dangerous. You're basically strapping your cargo to a bomb, right? So there's the question of whether it's going to be, safer in the future, whether accessibility means, reliability.
Yeah, so I think I have to push back a bit. And so it's true that space flight is, incredibly risky and there's a lot of dangers when it comes to it, but these are you can count, on one hand the amount of times um astronauts have died um in an event. Like so you mentioned the Challenger and the Columbia explosion. There's only one time that NASA astronauts have died, you know, and it was in a test launch. It wasn't even launched. The Apollo 1 mission, on a test pad, there was a fire, and sadly the crew members were trapped inside it. Um, but that's, I don't mean to, really lower the value of, these events, but that's
Things have
three.
changed, right?
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's three events over the, 50-year span of NASA, 60-year span of NASA. And while it is risky, it's some of the best engineers, best mathematicians working, and there's a lot of trial and error behind the scenes that you don't see. um, and all of that leads to, you know protecting astronauts as they go into space, which is a huge, which is a, a danger. But air flight was a danger. Traveling on an airplane, traveling in a car, all these things were dangerous when they were first introduced, but over time they become more and more reliable. And I think
That's
that's
true.
what you're seeing with spacecraft. And you can be sure that the government won't allow astronauts to fly in unsafe conditions, and that's why they regulate it at such a high level, especially when it comes to putting a man or woman on top of you know a rocket hurtling through space.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's definitely a point to be made there, which is like, again, it's not just like a cylinder of fuel and then a person at the top of it, right? There's a bunch of systems that go into play that they've invented over the years. Like I remember there was a competition a couple years ago on which company can design the best. I forget what it was called, but it was sort of like an ejection system where you had thrusters at
Yeah,
the
so
the
it's called,
capsule.
it's an abort system.
Mm,
If you want to see on the rocket, this thing at the top, this
mhm.
nose cone, it's supposed to fly the fly the system. This is where the astronauts are. This part and this part, this sort of needle thing, is supposed to fly astronauts off the top, and basically take the system with it. Oh
In
no.
the case that an explosion happens, right?
Yeah. So in case an emergency happens, it's called the abort system. And so if you look at SpaceX ships, it doesn't have that because it's built into the system itself.
Mm.
There's four rockets on the side, which will boost the capsule off the rocket in case something happens. Which is, it's really something that isn't thought of much, but they put a lot of time and effort into each individual part of the rocket itself.
So, I mean, obviously it will get safer, right? But besides that, there's also the question of whether space provides this unprecedented position of power that countries can take advantage of, right? The United States conducts a large amount of its intelligence, almost most of it, from satellite imagery. It's how we knew um, it's how we knew a lot of the stuff going into the Cold War, and prepped us for the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. Um, and like that just goes to show how easy it is to take advantage of this, new exploratory, useful space, um, that has almost infinite possibilities, right? That you definitely can't predict, especially with the cost of space travel inevitably getting cheaper and cheaper and more accessible. More and more countries are going to be doing it, and more countries that are already doing it are going to be doing it more, because you can actually do more trivial things now, like blast a car into space. Uh,
Yeah.
so, like, there is the fear that space can end up being just a new resource to fight over. Like, no matter how funny it is, the Space Force, like, is not exactly a joke, right? Like, it was made for some kind of a reason, um, some kind of a concern there.
Yeah, I think there's actually a misunderstanding with what Space Force is. It's sort of like the what happened with the Air Force.
Mm.
I think going into World War II, if I'm mistaken about that. If I'm not mistaken, sorry. So basically, the Air Force was a part of the Army and sort of split apart before World War II. If I'm wrong about that, I apologize, but that's what I believe it is. And it's basically all astronauts um, are a large part of the astronaut corps are Air Force members. They serve in the Air Force and they're basically pilots. So it's sort of the same thing, but it's bringing in things from like Space Command, and so it's sort of splitting off what the Air Force is of that part of the Air Force.
Hmm, I see. But they're yeah.
But there are definitely some things yeah that when it comes to space militarization that are definitely like not
Surveillance. Yeah.
yeah, surveillance is a huge problem when it comes to space militarization and reconnaissance that isn't necessarily allowed.
But it's not like super cool and developed as some people think, right? It's not
Yeah.
like we
So
don't have
yeah,
orbital
militarization.
bombardment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not some like Star Wars thing or
Mhm.
like lasers in space. It's basically just satellites watching over you
Mhm.
when you don't want them to.
Just still
Um,
scary, but
yeah,
not as scary as like
it's not as flashy. It's
militarization.
not as flashy.
Yeah. So obviously, like to prevent conflict, things have to be done, right? There are a couple of legal solutions that I think the UN has gone through, but I would say that they're kind of incomplete. Like I think in the 1950s, like just to show how archaic these laws are, in the 1950s, the UN decided that space was a commons, right? And then they put out a treaty. 10 years later, they ratified it, saying that no country can legally claim like the moon or something. But it's still pretty vague, especially concerning the fact that technology has changed so much since then. Like how people thought they're like when the field changes, you can't really apply old laws to it, especially because behaviors, interactions, and available resources are all just completely different. So I would say the UN should definitely review it because, especially with the global conflicts that are going on now, uh, like it is a concern what countries might be doing with space. I think a lot of countries that some might deem dangerous or unpredictable, like Iran and China, have like the capability to send surveillance satellites into space, and you would have no idea. So there is a debate to be had over what we can do with that.
Yeah, it's really weird to think that a lot of these laws defining what we can do in space were made at a time when what we could do in space wasn't really a lot.
Yeah,
Like you couldn't see into the future Elon Musk sending cars into space.
yeah.
In the 50s, it's not a thing that you're really
They
thinking
had
about.
Sputnik, which was like a tinfoil ball that leap every
Yeah.
couple seconds.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
but like it demonstrates that it's like a quickly developing issue, and it's definitely worth keeping your eyes on.
yeah, definitely. So I think that's it. That's our episode for today.
Yeah,
If you guys, the listeners, want to, if you have any topics that you want us to talk about, that you want to hear about, let us know. We definitely like to hear your input. We hope you guys have enjoyed listening to us talk about space, uh, looking at my rocket and other space memorabilia. Thank you guys for listening. Peace.
peace. Signing out.